All right, welcome everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 28th. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture Conformance sub-project meeting for this day. And just a couple of things on the agenda. I will share that. All right, agenda for today. I will add one item here, and the rest is Hippie Hacker. So an update on what we're working on for the behavior-driven KEP, which we've been working on for quite some time, but rather slowly. Essentially, we have more or less the tooling ready to go end-to-end, or it's nearly ready, that will allow us to use a list of behaviors as the coverage metric. So we'd have a list of behaviors that we agree on and that the set of approvers for behaviors agrees on. And then when the test will have metadata tagged in them, and the tooling will identify whether every behavior is covered by a conformance test. This allows us to separate the reviews of what the thing should do versus the tests that evaluate whether it does it. And we can have different pools of reviewers for those. Plan would be to have an end-to-end demonstration of that, maybe by the next meeting here, and then start working on migrating or defining all the behaviors such that our existing tests all cover those, and eventually move to having a CI job that validates the coverage percentage rather than using endpoints, using coverage of behavior. So all of that, like I said, in the next couple of weeks, we should get the end-to-end example done and merged, I hope. And then we'll work forward on increasing the coverage and keep both systems running in parallel, at least until we've converted on that. At that point, we'll be prepared to talk to SIGs and start to solicit them to define their behaviors. It should be clear enough what they need to do. So any questions on that before we move to Hippie's agenda?
Just so I'm clear, I think one of the things we're waiting on right now is John Schnake's redo of how reporting logic is done for conformance tests, right? So this is the thing that does a dry run through Ginkgo instead of trying to parse a bunch of stuff out from the AST.
Yeah, I just actually pushed to that. I thought the other day it was going to go green when I rebased, but it turned out there were some other changes in some of the text. And so when I rebased, like my documents didn't match. I took too long to figure that out, but I just found it and updated the document. So I'm hoping that should be good to go now. We'll see.
Okay, good.
All right, I'll keep an eye on that.
All right, thank you all. And why don't I stop presenting, and Hippie, you can take over. If
you can't hear anything from Hippie.
Yeah, if you're talking, we're not hearing you.
You don't show up as muted on Zoom, but we're not hearing anything from you.
You can also only see, like, barely see you.
Still not hearing anything. while we're waiting, I notice on the conformance board, which I'll paste the link to in chat, that we have a couple PRs pending approval. Clayton, maybe you can take a look at those sometime later today or when you get a chance.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay. And I had another PR assigned to you, which I'll get on the board and get in that column, which sounds like this was somebody trying to rewrite the scheduler preemption test to address some of the concerns you had about how this worked on heavily loaded clusters. And I just wanted to confirm that their PR looks good to me, but I wanted to confirm it addresses your concerns.
Okay, I'll go dig into it. Yeah, I have noticed that a lot of our scheduling tests are just very fragile to different configurations. I don't know how many people doing conformance have complained about it. It just like whenever I see someone like, oh, I'll just work around this by hacking the cluster, I'm like, well, the test probably isn't. So this one just triggered, and I've asked that team to stay focused on making sure that when they do fix scheduler tests, they do it for everyone.
Okay.
Testing?
We can hear you now, Hippie.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Everything runs on batteries. Apparently, they were all dead. I'm going to try to share my screen. So I've got a couple of things on the agenda. The first one is kind of demoing a bit of our initial part of our test writing workflow and how to get working with API Snoop as far as test writing. And the second is we were going to bring up the API Snoop CNCF IO progress, but I'm having some trouble this morning with that. And we on the CNCF CI on the Prow progress job, we now have images getting created, but we'll be working on that a bit more this next week. On the test writing progress, we've got different things that need to be promoted that are on the board, but we've got the 5 endpoints that were increased. They've got one, so in the test writing progress, I'm not sharing my screen yet, am I? Share conformance meeting. So this area down here, these are already merged, and this other one will merge by the end of the day. It was just missing an LGTM. And I think that Aaron just mentioned that there were quite a few ready for looking at in the needs approval area. So I'm looking forward to those merging as well. So backing up to our workflow demo, I'm going to try to share a screen. And we'll see how that goes. Share desktop 3, and so you should see our flow. Eventually, this will be running in clusters. So you just deploy, do a kubectl apply YAML and do some attaching. But this is our current flow starting from terminal. And so I'm going to paste this shared session into our chat. So whenever we create a session that brings up something we share within our team or with other people we're working on, you can either click on the URL or you can paste that into a terminal. Our flow that we have been working on here, this is where we just use kind and deploy an admin token and then deploy our kubemax deployment. And we've opted for right now for today to do our cluster setup, which is it runs out of cluster. It allows us to connect various pieces together. So when we have source blocks like this, will allow us to create a second eye over here. So here's our teammate attach. So now we have two windows, and we'll create a kind cluster. Make sure that we don't have one first. It'll delete it and then add it. So this is starting from kind. Won't take too long to deploy this. What we're using here is going to be using tilt to deploy our images into the cluster, including the database. And the database on its initial load will pull down the latest successful jobs from our bucket in order to compare for conformance numbers. So there's the cluster has been deployed, and then we'll this will run tilt in the other window. Our tilt file currently, and hey, it's launched over here. And I'll bring this over as well. This was
I'm not super familiar with tilt. Can you explain what this is doing?
Sure. It may be easier if I do this. Will it go over here? We'll just close this completely out. Token for a moment. So we'll delete that one. This takes within our repo, it takes our components that are part of API Snoop and builds the images and push them to the cluster based on a config. If we look at we have a special file in our repo that's a tilt file, and it just references our deployment YAML. And based on the name of the images on the left under the Docker build areas on line numbers 8 and 9, we'll deploy our web app, which is will be the APISnoop.io site, and how we compare whether coverage increased for a particular test that we're writing. Hasura, which is an interface to Postgres that creates all of the tables and data manipulation. And we're not building our Postgres, we're just using our upstream. So we comment it out if you want to turn it off or on. And currently this deployment's missing the audit logger because we don't want to use the audit logger unless we're actually writing a test, because we don't care about receiving events from via the audit sync. And the reason that we use tilt is that while we're working on anything within the apps themselves, if we touch any of those files, it will auto rebuild the app and push it into the cluster to ease in creating it. If you're not developing on API Snoop, then we will have it to a point where you just do kubectl apply a single YAML file, and it brings everything up. So I think the last thing we're looking for is Postgres seems happy, Hasura seems happy, so we can actually go and look at the logs for those. So this also allows you to more easily see what the logs are for the different areas. So you can look at the build logs or the runtime logs for the various pods. So we can see that in our web app, has it been able to connect to the DB yet? Hasura is applying migrations, which takes an empty Postgres server and applies all of the API Snoop SQL and creates all the tables. And one of the things that it does is pull down the latest successful job build and creates the index that we need to see what our coverage is. So that's running right now. So we're waiting for this to kind of tilt up. So the cluster is up. If we make this, let's do it full screen for a minute. This is on the kind level, the containers that are running. If we go over to our, I think it's our mock template. This is how we would normally go through and verify that our different components are running. So there's Hasura, which we're waiting for it to finish its deployments. And what we're looking for eventually, this is just starting a SQL connection. There's no relations yet. As soon as the migrations happen, we'll have all of the data that we need to explore the API and to write the tests. So still applying migrations. If I open up any of our existing tickets, all of our tickets that we work on are published in the API Snoop folder. You can go through, and the content of these are how we create the tickets from scratch. Caleb, are any of these the recent ones that you submitted? You wanna...
I think they've been migrated somewhere else.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll come back to those. So the amount of data it has to pull down is around 1.5 gigs. But when it's processed, it ends up being around 420 megs because it's duplicate data and entries and whatnot. We have a new web UI that was part of our. Let me go back to last week. That's going to show our progress over time, and it's part of what's deployed here. But we'll show that more in 2 weeks' time. I think what my goal here is to see if anybody else can get a chance to run this as well, and we can look at improving the flow of choosing what to write and and creating that backlog until John's work is ready. Should have loaded the DB before. Is there any questions about what we're doing, or understand how it's useful and how it's helping us choose what to write?
So how does this help us choose what tests to write?
When all of the tickets that we create inside of so let me see, I'm going to go. If you go to our conformance definition board and we go look at the stuff that's in the done column, all of those tickets that we've been working on started in the to triage area as tickets, and the process goes from going through our workflow here to select endpoints that are core, stable, and untested, and then writing a description, like finding the documentation for that, and then finding an example test, and it makes it quite easy to go through and write those samples here, and then export them as a ticket. And then once the ticket is approved, then we have this verified, agreed on set of tests to write. And then those test definitions are turned into PRs, which, because the way that we write them in our literature, we have the all the documentation there. It's mostly turning those well-defined tickets into a PR itself, just by polishing it up and getting it through the normal PR process. But it verifies that you've taken all the steps necessary to ensure that it does get promoted pretty much before it's even approved from the to triage to sorted backlog.
Is this also the same way that we can generate a report of what endpoints are covered at a given point in time? Like I personally am kind of out of touch with where we were with endpoint coverage as of the last release and where we are as of now.
This is where we would generate that.
Okay.
That's what I'm kind of walking through here, is to find those numbers. So that also can be verified by someone else, because for the most part, you get a cluster up and you run tilt up, and you can do what we're doing here without any extra work. Because we're using tilt, a lot of the stuff just works. So if I go to a local web page, because I'm running tilt, it forwards all the ports. So when I go to port what is this, 10350, it has all of our pods deployed, and one of those pods is our web app, and it has a port forwarding for that. So it actually brings up the API Snoop interface. This is in progress, so it's currently not up, but that will be part of what's deployed, and that same interface will be the one that's on APISnoop.io, but it will be continually refreshed every 4 hours or whenever that job fires for the bucket that's our primary target. Hasura is another interface that we've been using, and Hasura is a GraphQL interface. So if I click here, this is what our web UI is based on. Ooh, and that is so tiny. We'll make it much, much bigger. So we could go through here, for example, and select endpoint coverage limit for 10 where tested equals false, and where equals it's core, right? Stable, that's right. So we want stable and tested, just like the way to query via the UI to say, here's a bunch of, maybe we don't want all those responses. So in the query, how do we not select everything? Delete them from the, just select, so we'll just do bucket, whether it's tested or not. So we really just want to know the endpoint, right? Operation ID. So what operation IDs were tested, and yeah, that's it, right? So that list over here of operation IDs are possible ones for stable endpoints that need to be tested. And if we go back, it's just, I missed my, go back. And of course, Postgres is running, so you could run, connect directly to Postgres, and that's usually what we end up doing, is Postgres queries directly, not with a UI wrapping it. Yeah, so I'll go back to that. The UI is just useful for some folks. So I'm going to move the the tilt deployment out of the way, just to give us some more screen room and full screen this side. And so if we check that it all worked now, we've worked to make sure that there's a nice description next to all the tables. So you can say the API operation material, there's a view into that, and it's got details on every operation ID taken from the OpenAPI spec. And then the parameter material is for each parameter, because if we wanted to look at all the parameters of the APIs as far as at that level, because we've looked at exploring that in the past. There's the audit event material. You can see that the audit event material is 870 megs. Wow, it's usually around 400. This must have been a really heavy audit event job. And then the bucket job swagger. So each bucket, we've only got one that we look at upstream, and each job, primarily we load one by default. It has a particular Git version of the OpenAPI Swagger JSON, and this is loaded into that table. So we can see we've got just over 3 meg there. Views don't take any data because they're just views into material. So our endpoint coverage material is the view that we're working on to say what is our endpoint coverage. And it's just a materialized view of other queries into the system. And again, the comments kind of help you figure out what tables are there. The endpoints hit by new test view is when we're writing a test and we are doing the example to create a 2 triage ticket to say this is the increase, this is the particular endpoints that if we write this test, it's gonna meet. And we'll update that for John's approach to here is the specific increase in behaviors over time. The raw audit events themselves are flowing into, that's like the raw, so there it is around 400 meg for the raw audit event, but we process the data into audit event material of around 900 meg. That's why it's taking a while. Anyway, so that's the queries. And this is I think we were still looking at to make sure this is the number of endpoints that are there. So this getting distinct operations where it's not the live data. And I think this flow we may need to work on a little bit, but this is identify untested feature using API Snoop. So we could modify this, and we usually do, for when we're ready to write a test. So if it comma here, this is a list of the path, the operation ID, and the path and the description, where stuff's not, where the path doesn't include the word volume. Real simple query. Order by the operation ID, so it's an alphabetical order. Reverse it, so we start at the bottom and limit it by 25. This helps us choose a particular endpoint. If we go through our existing test, anytime we create a triaged operation ID, it includes why we chose that particular endpoint and the query we did to choose it. Then like if you were to use this as a template for creating a ticket, you would go through and find the documentation for the particular endpoint or set of endpoints you wanted to write a test for. And that documentation all goes in here because you see the little export, the brown export, that's stuff that gets exported into the ticket that we create to get approved by this working group. Then we kind of go into mock test. So before we do the mock test, I want to spin up our in-cluster audit sync. So I'm going to go back over to our tilt file, and I might unmaximize this so you can see it happen. So I'm going to uncomment the audit logger. So we'll uncomment that, and then we'll also uncomment the audit sync. So if I do this and I save it, this is one thing that we've enjoyed around tilt is it auto deploys based on just saving this file. So that will now go through and deploy the audit logger, build the audit logger from source, and tell the Kubernetes API server, by the way, please send all your audit events to this in-cluster audit sync. So we'll kind of just wait a moment for that to go. I think it's up. So if we go through to look at this particular mock test is we decided to look at a config map with a static label. We just kind of put an outline in text so that without reading the code, we can decide before, is this a good test to write or not? And then we have a simple example in Go here that reads the kubeconfig from a file, does a live test. So we'll just, and the way that we write it is because of our literate programming, we don't write the whole, we just put the snippet that's most important, and then it runs it, and it just said, hey, there's 16 pods in the cluster there. If we were to deploy another pod, it would print out, it didn't write any source code out, it just, or it did underneath the covers, but this allows us to go through and write this in a way where we can export this into the ticket and just the snippet is there really quickly. So if we go past here and look like verify that it has increased our coverage. So first thing to do is make sure that we find our user agents. So I think we probably need to wait 30 seconds or so. The API server doesn't continuously stream every audit event every second that it happens. It does it in batches of around 30 seconds. So if we wait about 30 seconds or so, we should be able to query this and get I think we set the user agent to live testing inside the query. If the demo is going to work on the fly. Let's just make sure, let me make sure that we actually set our user agent there. I'll go ahead and run this other test too, just to see if it runs. Get 2 different tests that ran. Now it's got an error in the code, so go and delete that one. All right, I'm gonna chalk that up to trying to do a live demo. This query here would show endpoints hit. So we say what pieces of the API were hit by this snippet of code that we're about to paste into a ticket, and it would show the operation ID, whether it was hit by an EDE test, and what was hit by the new test. You can tell if it was hit by EDE at all, whether it was conformance, and that it was hit by the new EDE test. And this important one here, you can see like previously we had this one is going to increase coverage. This is not working at the moment. And then our final notes are, because we want the ticket to have this information, we just put it in here to export please tag for SIG testing, SIG architecture, and SIG conformance. Yeah, that's kind of it for the flow that we're using to write the test. And I'm sorry that the query didn't work out of the box. I'd intended to show something else today.
Also exporting?
Yeah, oh, that's right. So I don't know if anybody wants to, for fun, either click on the URL that I shared inside to everyone in Zoom group chat, or paste into iTerm2 or its equivalent, the whole SSH GUID at whatever. But the idea is now that we're done with the ticket, we've done this work together, everybody should be able to easily take it out of the cluster or out of the little, shared environment and create a ticket. So we have a set of things we changed to do that. And of course, everybody that's connecting can drive the session as well. But what the keystroke we hit to kind of get this out of here is -EE to export it, and then we export it to GitHub flavored Markdown. Just 1 second. So we'll do. Oh, I had something selected. So -EE GitHub flavored Markdown. Temporary buffer. So this whole thing is in Markdown format for what we use to create tickets, the export of this session. And it says we deployed API Snoop. Here was the query that we used to choose our endpoints. Here were the endpoints that we focused on. Make this full screen and maybe full screen like that. But somebody else is connected to half screen, so it's only going to show the smallest size. And then our Go code. So if I went through and yanked this out, it should populate all the way back, and I can go through and create a new ticket. And I'll paste this into the channel instead. So there's an example of the ticket creation. Any questions over that workflow, or anybody interested in giving it a try?
Okay, so that's how we end up with tickets like something I pasted in chat.
Yeah. This is the flow to make a ticket. And then once the ticket's approved, we use a very similar approach to write the ticket, but it's more the standard how everybody does everything. You know, we do use this style, but it doesn't matter because the thing is getting agreement and quick buy off in a way that everybody understands why.
I certainly feel like the ticket gives me sufficient info to review what's going on. I guess my only other question is, when can we expect to have more tickets to triage? And I still kind of go back to, I feel like this group could benefit from a report that shows us what the progress, just what the progress has been in endpoint coverage since the start of the year or since the last release of Kubernetes.
We're part of the rewrites that we're probably like a week or two away from is showing that overtime graph. And we had some, like I was going to show that today in this demo, but the numbers I didn't agree with them, so I wanted to go back and really understand. To give you an idea, it said 45% conformance coverage, which I thought was great, but I want to really know that that's what's there. So when we'll have that next week, or in 2 weeks' time for sure. And as soon as I have it and I'm confident of it, I'll put it in the channel. That'll probably be like a demo site or something for the new GUI for API Snoop.
Okay. That's all the questions I had.
I think that's all from my team. I think I feel like we're doing pretty good in creating tickets. This last week when we made sure to go through and close the ones we had open, but needed to because we lost, so we've lost Devin. So I'm having to pick up the slack and refocus those of us that remain with a bit more effort. So it's taking a bit to ramp it up. But I think we're at a place with this flow that I'm happy that we can get the velocity and keep it. There's five endpoints that have just merged this last 2 weeks, and then I think we have another 5 to 7 in the to merge, and we've got several in progress. But yeah, I want to look forward to the actual report too.
All right, thanks, Happy. Is there anything else on the agenda there? Let me see.
There's a bunch of things around the test running review and promotions, I believe.
I think I kind of covered those. The link to the promotions in the document are the ones that need approval, and I think Aaron pointed to those. And then the other ones that are in the document are the ones that are done or merged, and they note the increase with a plus and a number. So those are the 5 that increases that were over the first part of this year. We should get another, like this next 2 weeks, it should get faster.
So I guess I had one other question with the time we have, unrelated to the API Snoop stuff. Michelle from SIG Storage has been working diligently to try and get a CSI mock driver set up so that we can get some kind of conformance testing around at least a mock implementation of a given CSI storage driver. However, what she's found is that even this mock driver that makes, you know, no assumptions about the cloud provider or storage providers that are available still needs privileged access in order to create a Unix socket to be able to communicate with the kubelet, which given our blanket lack of, you know, our blanket requirement for lack of privileged means that this can't be a conformance test. Is this the sort of thing we as a group feel like we could make an exception for, or is this a hard privileged just can't be a part of the conformance?
I think that this starts to come back to our discussion of profiles and probably privileged. We do have things that are privileged, grandfathered in privileged things, by the way, right now, I believe. But we probably need to, we need this program to be able to handle more functionality than the sort of scope we've given it so far. And I think the mechanism for that is going to be those profiles. So I think probably we need to resuscitate that effort and start to potentially divide things that are privileged, things that I mean, what we have to decide how we want to think about it. One of the ways to think about it is sort of larger use cases, like or particular ways in which you want to build out a cluster, like in a multi-tenant cluster, like I think OpenShift has these online multi-tenant clusters. There's probably certain functions that aren't available to the user, but we'd want to be able to say that from a user perspective, it's conforming in some way. But then for clusters where there is an administrator that has access, that administrative function also needs to be conforming. So almost like conforming in those different profiles of user versus administrator. That's one way to cut up profiles. I'm not sure if it's the right way, but I think we need to, the privilege kind of falls into that thing that there's going to be this set of use cases or users or workloads that require that, and those customers still want to be able to know that those workloads are portable across different vendors. So I think we have to address that somehow. And
yeah, so I feel like if we can't get two profiles sorted out, like what's the point of the working group, the conformance working group? Like if we can't figure out a way to subdivide these two very clear use cases, which is user workloads and administrative extension of a Kubernetes cluster, CRDs, CSI, CRI, then like we can't accomplish the goals of making sure that what people are asking for out of the conformance program.
Yeah. So why don't we take that up then? As we're making good progress on test writing with what II is doing. We've got the behavior stuff starting, I think, to wrap up in the next month or so, and I think that's the next thing we need to tackle. I think the behavior stuff kind of gives us an avenue for classifying behaviors into those two different profiles or categories without necessarily, with a little more granularity than the individual tests do. So I think that will be helpful in that regard as well.
Okay, I mean, I've got to admit, with the lovely Ginkgo tag stuff that we have at the moment, I don't see a sufficiently rich path or a sufficiently rich metadata to help us accomplish this. But I agree that this is the next area that we should be iterating on.
All right. Well, yeah, my expectation would be that the metadata associated with profiles is going to get attached to the behaviors, not to Ginkgo tags. And then, you know, it's still going to require likely us to, we might even have to break apart certain tests and things like that, but we'll have to see where we go with it.
Okay. Well, looking forward to seeing the implementation of behaviors, and
yeah, me too.
And looking forward to seeing the endpoint coverage report coming up.
All right. If there's nothing else, then maybe we get back 10 minutes. Going once here. All right. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Happy Tuesday.